The canister should not have been there. Vane Solari noticed it the way archivists notice everything that breaks a pattern, by the absence of what should have been in its place. Shelf 1417 of the Deepwell Annex, Column R, Position 9, the manifest listed a Keldrathi acoustic tablet, catalogued 400 years ago, temperature stable, magnetically inert. What occupied Position 9 instead was a cylinder of dark metal, roughly the length of Vane's forearm, sealed at both ends with caps of a material that did not reflect the archive's amber reading lamps. It absorbed the light, drank it. The surface was covered in fine grooves that might have been decorative, might have been script, might have been damage. Vane could not tell. And that uncertainty was what stopped him in the corridor with his scanner hanging loose in his three-fingered hand, and his morning schedule dissolving into irrelevance. He had worked in the Deepwell Annex for 11 years. In that time he had catalogued 642 objects, restored the atmospheric seals on 3 vaults, and authored a monograph on Keldrathi bonding adhesives that 4 people had read and 1 had cited. He was tessarine, slight, long-limbed, skin the color of river clay, with wide-set eyes adapted to the low amber light of archive interiors. The Tessarine Archival Authority employed 11,000 archivists across 9 institutions. Vane was not the best of them. He was not the worst. He was the one who came early and stayed late and never complained about the dust, and his supervisors valued him the way institutions value anyone who does not cause problems and does not seek promotion. Invisibly. The canister caused a problem. He pulled it from the shelf with both hands. It was heavier than it looked dense, the weight concentrated strangely, as if the interior were not uniform. The surface was cool but not cold. The grooves under his fingers felt precise, machined or carved with a tool that left no burr, no rough edge. He turned it slowly. The grooves formed lines and the lines formed patterns, and the patterns were not tessarine, not Keldrathi, not Hooven or Moresi or any of the 31 script families in the standard archival reference. They were something else. He checked the manifest again. His scanner confirmed. The acoustic tablet that should have been in Position 9 had been logged as present during the last full inventory, conducted 18 months ago by a team Vane had supervised. He had personally verified Column R the tablet had been there. Now it was not, and this thing was. Vane set the canister on the reading table in his cubicle and stared at it for a long time. The first irregularity he identified was material composition. His handheld spectrometer returned a reading that made no sense, a ferrous alloy with trace elements that the instrument classified as unknown, which was its way of saying the element did not appear in its database. The database contained every element identified in Concord map space. Unknown meant either the spectrometer was malfunctioning or the canister contained something from outside map space. Vane recalibrated and ran the scan again. Same result. He ran it a third time with the spectrometer pressed directly against the metal surface. Same result, plus a new anomaly. A faint electromagnetic emission from inside the canister, regular, rhythmic, at a frequency the spectrometer flagged as biological range. Something inside the canister was pulsing. Vane's hands trembled. He set the spectrometer down and folded his fingers together until the tremor stopped. He was an archivist. His training covered material analysis, environmental preservation, cataloging protocols, and the ethical handling of culturally sensitive objects. His training did not cover objects that pulsed. He should have reported it. He knew that. Standing Order 16 of the Archival Authority required that any unidentified object found outside its cataloged position be reported to the curatorial board within 1 working day. The board would dispatch a team. The team would extract the object, scan it, assign it a provisional classification, and lock it in a secure vault pending further study. The process took between 6 and 18 months. Vane had seen it happen 11 times. In every case the object had been mundane, a misfiled artifact, a cleaning tool left by maintenance staff, a fragment of shelf material that had broken loose during a tremor. In every case, the team had been thorough, professional, and slow. Vane did not report it. He told himself it was caution. The object might be fragile. The board's extraction teams were not always gentle. He had watched them crack a 900-year-old Maresi resonance plate by using magnetic clamps instead of hand lifts. He would do a preliminary assessment first, just enough to determine what he was dealing with, and then file the report with supporting data. It was responsible. It was prudent. It was the kind of reasoning that archivists used when they wanted to keep something for themselves, and Vane was honest enough to know it, and not honest enough to stop. He spent the first evening photographing the canister from every angle, using the archive's mechanical shutter camera, because the electromagnetic emission was interfering with digital imaging. 32 photographs, each from a different position, each capturing a different section of the grooved surface. When he laid the photographs out on the reading table in sequence, the grooves resolved into something unmistakable. Script, a written language. Dense, angular, composed of interlocking geometric forms that repeated with the precision of machine manufacture, but varied in ways that suggested meaning, not decoration. Not damage, language. And he could not read a single character. The archive's translation database contained samples from every known script in mapped space, living and dead, current and extinct, spanning 40,000 years of recorded civilization. Vane ran the photographs through it overnight while he slept on the narrow cot in the break room. When he returned to his cubicle at dawn, the results were waiting. No match. 0 partial matches. The system had compared the grooved characters against 4.7 million reference samples, and found nothing that correlated above random noise. The script on the canister was not from mapped space. Vane sat with that fact for a long time. The archive was quiet around him, the deep, layered quiet of a place that contained 12 million objects and the accumulated knowledge of a dozen civilizations, all of it sleeping in amber light and controlled atmosphere. The canister sat on his table, pulsing its faint electromagnetic heartbeat, and Vane stared at it and felt something shift inside his chest. Not excitement, exactly. Something older and less comfortable. A door opening in a room he had thought was fully mapped. He ran the spectrometer scan a 4th time, then a 5th. On the 5th pass, he narrowed the frequency band of the electromagnetic emission and discovered a secondary signal buried beneath the primary pulse, fainter, faster, cycling at an interval that did not correspond to any known communication protocol. The primary pulse said, "I am here." The secondary said something else, something more complex, a message wrapped inside a heartbeat, and Vane could not decode it, but he could measure it, and the measurement showed that it was accelerating. Not quickly, a fraction of a percentage per hour, but consistently, unmistakably, the canister was waking up. Over the next 3 days, the obsession took root. He stopped eating regular meals. The break room nutrient dispensers logged his visits. He went from 3 per day to 1, then to irregular intervals that followed no pattern except proximity to a breakthrough. He forgot to file his daily shelf condition reports. His supervisor, a meticulous Tessarine woman named Olesi who communicated primarily through disapproval, sent him 2 formal reminders. He acknowledged them and did not comply. The canister was not of conquered origin. That much was certain. But the question of how it had arrived on shelf 1417 consumed him. The Deepwell Annex was a sealed facility. Atmospheric controls, biometric access, vibration dampers, electromagnetic shielding. The annex was designed to preserve artifacts for millennia, which meant it was also designed to prevent unauthorized additions. Nothing entered without documentation. Nothing left without authorization. The manifest was law. And yet the canister was here, occupying a position that had held a different object 18 months ago, and no record existed of the substitution. He checked the access logs. Every entry to the annex for the past 2 years, 4,216 logged visits by authorized personnel. None flagged an anomaly. None recorded an object exchange at column R, position 9. He cross-referenced the logs against the environmental sensors, temperature fluctuations, atmospheric pressure changes, vibration events, looking for a moment when someone or something had entered the annex unrecorded. He found nothing. The security system was continuous, redundant, and as far as Vane could determine, unbroken. Which meant either the canister had been placed by someone with the ability to bypass every security protocol in the facility without leaving a trace, or it had simply appeared. Neither explanation was satisfactory. The first implied a level of technological sophistication that no conquered species possessed. The second was not an explanation at all. He tried a different approach. If the canister contained an electromagnetic emitter, that emitter had been active for some period of time before Vane noticed it. The annex's environmental monitoring system logged ambient electromagnetic readings every 6 hours as part of its atmospheric quality protocols. Vane pulled 18 months of readings for the sensor nearest to column R, sensor node 17 alpha, mounted on the ceiling 3 meters from position 9. The data was unremarkable for the first 16 months. Baseline readings within normal variance consistent with the electromagnetic output of 12 million catalogued artifacts sitting in controlled atmosphere. Then 2 months ago, a shift, subtle, a fractional increase in the ambient reading, well within the tolerance band, flagged by no automated alert, but present, consistent. Growing by increments so small that no monitoring system would have flagged them, unless someone pulled the raw data and plotted it against the baseline. Vane plotted it. The curve was unmistakable, a slow, steady rise that began exactly 2 months before he found the canister and continued through the present moment. The canister had not always been pulsing at its current strength. It had started quietly and grown louder, like a voice gradually raising itself from a whisper, testing whether anyone was listening. And for 2 months, no one had been. He ran the same analysis on adjacent sensor nodes, nodes 16 and 18, flanking column R on either side. Node 16 showed no anomaly. Node 18 showed a faint echo of the same rise, attenuated by distance. The pattern was consistent with a single point source at position 9, column R, broadcasting an electromagnetic signal that had been growing in strength for approximately 60 days. 2 months. The canister had been calling for 2 months before Vane heard it. He thought about the acoustic tablet, the Keldrathi piece that should have been in position 9 and was not. He pulled its full provenance record, origin, acquisition, conservation history, every time it had been moved or examined in 400 years of archival custody. The record was complete, unbroken. The tablet had been examined, photographed, and condition assessed during the last full inventory. Its position had been verified. It had been there. And then it had not been there, and the canister had been there instead, and the manifest had not been updated, and the access logs showed no anomaly, and the environmental sensors had noticed nothing except a whisper of electromagnetic noise that grew so slowly it was invisible unless you plotted 60 days of raw data against a baseline. Someone had made a substitution. Someone with technology sophisticated enough to enter a sealed archive, remove a 400-year-old artifact, replace it with a canister of unknown alloy containing an active emitter, and leave without triggering a single sensor, a single log entry, a single alarm. Someone who understood the archive systems well enough to know that the substitution would not be detected by routine monitoring. Someone who had counted on the possibility that a specific kind of archivist, patient, thorough, obsessive, would eventually notice the discrepancy and investigate. The thought made Vane's skin tighten, not with fear, with the recognition of being known, understood, predicted, by something he had not yet met. On the second day, Olesi appeared at his cubicle. She was taller than Vane by a head, her clay-colored skin paler in the way that senior archivist's skin always paled from decades under the amber lamps. She stood in the doorway and looked at the canister on his table, and then at Vane, and then at the canister again. "That is not in the manifest," she said. "No. Standing Order 16. I'm conducting a preliminary assessment." Standing Order 16 does not include a preliminary assessment exception. The object may be fragile. The board's extraction protocols are not your concern. Ulysses' voice was level. It was always level. In 11 years, Vane had never heard it rise or fall. "Filed the report, Vane, today." She left. Vane stared at the canister. The pulse had accelerated again, measurably faster than yesterday, the secondary signal growing stronger relative to the primary. He ran his fingers along the grooved surface and felt the vibration travel up through his hand and into his wrist, a resonance that sat in his bones like a tuning fork pressed against a table. He did not file the report. On the fourth day, he made a discovery that stopped his breath. He had been photographing the end caps, the sealed faces of the canister where the grooved script was densest, the characters packed so tightly they almost merged into a continuous texture. His camera's macro lens, pressed close, captured details invisible to the unaided eye. And in those details, buried in the densest section of script, he found a symbol he recognized. Not from the archive's database, not from any reference text, from a personal research project he had abandoned 6 years ago, a comparative study of pre-conquered astronomical notations. The symbol was a representation of a specific stellar configuration, a trinary system in the Deep Survey catalogs, located in a region of space that had been declared off-limits by the Conquered Exploration Authority 40 years ago. The quarantine zone. The place no one went, because the early survey teams that had gone there had come back changed. Not damaged, not injured, but different in ways that the debriefing reports described with careful, clinical euphemisms that Vane had read once, years ago, and never forgotten. The symbol on the canister was a star map, and the stars it mapped were in the quarantine zone. Vane's obsession metastasized. He accessed the archive's restricted stacks, collections sealed by order of the curatorial board, accessible only to senior staff with specific clearance codes. Vane was not senior staff, but he had worked in the annex for 11 years, and in that time he had performed maintenance on every environmental system in the facility, including the ones that controlled access to the restricted stacks. He knew the codes not because he had sought them, but because he had been the one to reset them after a power failure 4 years ago, and the codes had not been changed since. The archival authority was meticulous about preservation and careless about security, because no one had ever wanted to break into an archive before. The restricted stacks held 1,400 objects in 12 vaults. He searched methodically, vault by vault, reading the sealed manifests through the observation panels, cross-referencing each entry against the star map symbol he had identified. Vault 1, Keldrathi ceremonial instruments all accounted for. Vault 2, Hooven diplomatic archives, sealed by treaty not relevant. Vault 3 stopped him cold. A collection of fragments recovered from the quarantine zone's border by the last survey team before the lockdown. 11 pieces of debris, classified as structural material, origin unknown, inert. They had been sitting in the vault for 38 years, unstudied, because the curatorial board had sealed them pending a review that had never been scheduled. The review was still listed as pending in the board's active queue, 38 years of pending, a bureaucratic immortality that only an institution as patient as the archival authority could sustain. The fragments were made of the same alloy as the canister. The spectrometer confirmed it, identical ferrous composition, identical unknown trace elements, identical electromagnetic signature, the same material from the same source. and when Vane placed the fragments on the table beside the canister's pulse quickened. Not by much, a fraction of a percentage in frequency, but measurably, unmistakably, the electromagnetic emission from inside the canister accelerated in the presence of the fragments. It was responding to them, recognizing them. The secondary signal flared, a burst of activity that lasted 4 seconds, complex and rapid, before settling back to its accelerated baseline. Vane stared at his spectrometer readings and felt the hair on his forearms rise. The fragments responded too, not with electromagnetic emission, they had none of their own, but the spectrometer detected a resonance in their molecular structure, a sympathetic vibration at a frequency that precisely matched the canister's secondary signal. The fragments were receiving, the canister was broadcasting. They were communicating, these pieces of unknown alloy, separated for 38 years and now reunited on a reading table in a restricted vault by an archivist who should have filed his report 4 days ago. Vane's mouth went dry. He sat in the restricted vault with the canister and the fragments spread before him, the amber archive lights casting long shadows, and he understood that he had found something that the archival authority, the curatorial board, and the Concord Exploration Authority had collectively failed to find for 38 years. Not because they lacked the equipment or the expertise, because they lacked the patience. The canister had been waiting, pulsing its quiet signal on a shelf in the Deepwell Annex, surrounded by 12 million sleeping artifacts, and nobody had noticed because nobody had looked at shelf 1417, column R, position 9 with the kind of attention that Vane Solari brought to everything. Slow, thorough, obsessive, unglamorous. The archivist's curse, the archivist's gift. On the 5th day, the canister's surface changed. Vane had been running a thermal analysis when he saw it. The grooved script, which had been static since he first held the cylinder, began to glow. Faintly, so faintly that he almost missed it, would have missed it if he had not been holding the canister at the precise angle where the amber reading lamp's reflection fell away and the canister's own luminescence became visible. A pale blue-white light, threading through the grooves the way water threads through cracks in stone. Not uniform, sequential. The glow traveled along the script lines in a specific direction, top to bottom, left to right, as if the surface were being read by something inside the cylinder. Vane photographed the progression. Frame by frame, the glow intensified, each pass brighter than the last, the characters becoming legible in their own light, still unreadable, still unknown, but visible now in a way they had not been before. The canister was illuminating its own text, showing it, presenting it to whoever was watching. Vane was watching. He counted the passes. The glow cycled through the entire surface every 73 seconds, and with each cycle the luminescence grew brighter and the electromagnetic secondary signal grew stronger. By the 3rd hour, his spectrometer was struggling to keep up with the data flow. The secondary signal had fragmented into multiple channels, each carrying a different frequency pattern, as if the canister were running a systems check, activating subsystems one by one, preparing for something. The other archivist on the night shift, a junior named Tessal who worked in the Annex's conservation lab 2 corridors away, appeared at the vault door with a puzzled expression. Node 17 just tripped a secondary alert, he said. Electromagnetic anomaly, low priority, but I've never seen one from the restricted section before. He peered past Vane's shoulder. What is that glowing? Material phosphorescence, Vane said, triggered by a thermal differential during my analysis. I'm documenting it. Tessal looked unconvinced. He looked at the canister, at the fragments arrayed beside it, at the stack of photographs and spectral printouts and handwritten notes that covered every surface of the reading table. He looked at Vane's face, the shadows under his wide-set eyes, the pallor that came from 5 days of insufficient nutrition and too much time under amber lamps. You look terrible, Tessal said. Noted. Want me to reset the node alarm? Yes. Tessal left. Vane stared at the canister and tried to steady his breathing. The cover story, material phosphorescence from thermal differential, was technically possible. It was also transparently inadequate for anyone who spent more than 30 seconds in the vault. He was running out of time. Running out of explanations. Running out of the institutional invisibility that had protected his investigation for 5 days. By evening, the glow was strong enough to cast faint shadows on the reading table. The secondary electromagnetic signal had accelerated to a frequency his spectrometer could barely track. The fragments vibrated steadily, a low hum that Vane could feel through the table's surface, and the grooved characters had begun to change. Not the shapes remained fixed, carved, or machined with a permanence that nothing in Vane's experience could account for. What changed was the luminescent pattern. Characters that had glowed blue-white shifted to gold, and the gold deepened, and the deepened gold began to pulse independently of the primary electromagnetic heartbeat, creating a secondary visual rhythm that overlaid the first. 2 patterns, 2 frequencies, 2 messages. The canister was speaking in counterpoint. On the 6th day, something else changed. Vane arrived at the vault and found the canister's temperature had shifted again. It had been stable at ambient for days, 21 degrees, matching the vault's climate control to the 10th of a degree. Now it was 24, 3 degrees warmer, and the warmth was not uniform. It radiated from one end cap more than the other, and the grooved script around that cap glowed brighter than its counterpart. The asymmetry was new. Everything about the canister had been bilaterally symmetric until now. Same script density on both caps, same luminescence, same electromagnetic output from each end. The symmetry breaking meant something had changed inside the canister. Something had oriented. Something was pointing at him. He measured the temperature gradient with a contact thermometer, mapping 6 positions along the canister's length. The gradient was precise, a smooth curve from 24 degrees at the active cap to 21 degrees at the passive end, with the inflection point exactly at the midpoint of the cylinder. The curve was too smooth to be natural. It was engineered. The canister was controlling its own thermal gradient with a specificity that implied active internal regulation, a mechanism that was not just storing energy but directing it, preparing an output channel, getting ready to speak. That morning he found the seam. The canister's end caps were not welded or fused. They were sealed by a mechanism, a subtle arrangement of the grooved script itself. Certain characters recessed slightly deeper than others, forming a pattern that, when Vane traced it with his fingertip, produced a faint vibration, a tactile interface. The script was not just language, it was a lock. He spent 2 full days mapping the lock pattern, photographing, measuring, cross-referencing with every mechanical seal mechanism in the archive's engineering database. Nothing matched. The lock was unique, a design principle that no conquered species had ever employed. But as Vane studied it, he began to see a logic. The recessed characters were not random. They formed a sequence, a specific order in which they were meant to be pressed, like keys on an instrument. And the sequence, when he finally assembled it from the macro photographs and the measurements and his own intuition, the archivist's intuition, the sense for pattern that came from 11 years of reading, objects the way other people read faces. The sequence was musical. A melody. The lock was a melody, encoded in tactile characters, waiting to be played by a fingertip on the surface of a cylinder that had been pulsing in an archive for at least 18 months and possibly much longer. He tested it once. A single character pressed, the first note of the sequence. The vibration that answered was immediate and strong, the canister responding to the correct input with an intensity that made Vane pull his hand back. The gold glow brightened for 3 seconds, and the fragments on the table actually chimed. A pure harmonic tone, brief and clear, that rang off the vault's stone walls and died. Vane waited, his pulse hammering, but no alarm sounded. No footsteps in the corridor. The vault's acoustic insulation, designed to protect fragile objects from external vibration, had kept the sound contained. He had found the first note, 7 more waited. On the 8th day, Olesi came to the restricted vault. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, her eyes moving from the canister to the fragments to the spread of photographs and spectral printouts and handwritten notes that covered every surface of the reading table. She looked at Vane, and for the first time in 11 years, he saw something in her face that was not disapproval. It was closer to recognition. "I checked the access logs," she said. "You have been in this vault for 3 days." "I have. The code should have been changed after the power failure. I noted it at the time. It was not done." "No." Standing Order 16, Vane. "I know." She stepped into the vault. She looked at the canister, its grooved surface glowing now, the blue, white, and gold patterns pulsing in their dual rhythm, the light playing across the walls of the vault in shifting geometric patterns that no conquered artisan had designed. She looked at it for a long time. "That is not from here," she said. "No." She turned to the fragments, touched one with a long finger, pulled her hand back immediately, not in pain but in surprise. The sympathetic vibration was strong enough now to feel. "These were sealed by the board 38 years ago." "Yes." "Nobody has looked at them since." "No, nobody has." Olesi was quiet for a moment. The canister pulsed, the vault hummed. 12 million objects slept above them, undisturbed, perfectly catalogued, perfectly preserved, perfectly irrelevant to what was happening on this table. "You should have reported it," she said. "I should have. I am going to pretend I did not see this. You have until end of day tomorrow." She paused. "File the report, Vane, but file it with good data." She left, the vault door sealed behind her. Vane looked at the canister and understood that Olesi had just given him permission, not officially, not in any way that would survive a board inquiry, but in the only way that mattered between archivists. She had seen the object. She had recognized that it was important, and she had decided to trust his judgment for 24 more hours. He could not waste them. 24 hours. The number sat in his mind with a weight disproportionate to its size. He had worked in the annex for 11 years, 4,015 days, give or take, and each of those days had been interchangeable, one amber-lit shift blending into the next, the work steady and predictable and utterly without urgency. Now he had 24 hours, and they felt like the narrowest corridor he had ever walked through. Everything he had done in 8 days, the photographs, the spectral analysis, the sensor data, the star map, the restricted vault, the fragments, all of it was prologue. The melody was the thing. The melody was the door. And behind the door was the answer to a question he had not known he was asking until the canister appeared on a shelf where a Keldrathi acoustic tablet was supposed to be. He checked the melody sequence one final time. 8 characters, 8 notes. He had verified each one independently, testing it against the canister's response, a brief, precisely calibrated press, followed by a read of the electromagnetic output, confirming that the canister's internal mechanism recognized the input as correct. 7 of the 8 had been tested. The 8th, the final note, he had saved, deliberately. Because the first 7 had each produced a stronger response than the one before, and the progression suggested that the 8th would trigger not just a response but a transition, an opening. And openings, in Vane's experience, were not reversible. Vane's hands shook. He set down his notes and walked 3 laps around the restricted vault, breathing the controlled atmosphere, counting the shelves, grounding himself in the physical reality of the space. Then he sat down and played the sequence. His fingertip pressed the first recess character, a vibration stronger than before, a resonance that traveled through the metal and into the bones of his hand. The second character, the vibration deepened, found a harmonic, became a tone that he felt in his sternum. The third, the fourth. each one adding a layer to the resonance, building a chord that the canister's body amplified until the metal hummed with a sound that was almost too low to hear and too present to ignore. The fragments on the table vibrated in sympathy. The amber reading lamp flickered. Fifth character, the sixth. The chord built, each note locking into place with a precision that made Vane's breath catch. He could feel the melody now, not just in the metal, not just in his fingertips, but in the air of the vault, in the shelves, in the stone floor beneath his chair. The canister was turning the entire vault into a resonating chamber, amplifying its melody through the materials around it, and the melody was beautiful in a way that Vane had no framework to describe. Not tessarine music. Not any music he had ever heard. Something that used intervals his ears had never encountered and made them feel inevitable. The seventh character, the eighth. The canister opened. Not with a crack or a hiss, or any theatrical release of ancient atmosphere. The end caps simply withdrew into the body of the cylinder, retracting along machined channels that Vane had not been able to see until they moved, and the interior was exposed. Light. Not amber, not the warm institutional glow of the archive. A cold, clear, blue-white radiance that poured from the canister's interior like water from an open channel, filling the vault with a light that had no visible source. A luminescence that seemed to originate from the material itself, from the inner surface of the cylinder, which was inscribed with the same angular script, but in a denser, more intricate arrangement, the characters so fine they looked like circuits. Like the wiring diagram of something immensely complex, rendered on a surface the size of a forearm. And at the center of the cylinder, suspended in the light, held by nothing Vane could see, a small object. A disc, flat, circular, roughly the diameter of his palm, made of a material that was neither the dark alloy of the canister nor any substance he could identify by sight. It looked like compressed starlight, a pale, iridescent surface that shifted color as he moved his head, blue to silver to a faint gold that reminded him of morning light on shallow water. The disc was covered in script, too, but different from the canisters, smaller, more fluid, arranged in concentric rings that spiraled inward toward a central point where a single character sat, larger than the rest, pulsing with the same electromagnetic rhythm that had drawn him to the canister 8 days ago. The fragments on the table erupted. Not physically, they did not move, but their sympathetic vibration peaked, a sudden harmonic spike that Vane felt in his teeth, and the fragments began to glow. The same blue-white radiance, the same sourceless luminescence. 38 years of classified inertness, and now they were alive, resonating with the opened canister, responding to the disc, a scattered family recognizing its center. Vane reached for the disc. His fingers entered the light, and the light was warm, not canister warm, not body temperature. Warm the way sunlight is warm on skin that has been too long indoors. A living warmth, a welcoming warmth. He touched the disc. The archive vanished. Not physically, he could still feel the chair beneath him, the table's edge against his forearm, the dry, controlled air in his lungs. But his vision whited out, replaced by something that was not sight and not imagination and not memory. A transmission. Information pouring through the contact between his fingertip and the disc's surface, dense and structured, organized in layers that his mind processed the way it processed language. Not all at once, but in cascading comprehension, each layer building on the one before. He saw a world. Not tessarine, not conquered. A world of blue oceans and green continents under a single yellow sun, vivid, lush, chaotic with life, its atmosphere thick with water vapor and oxygen in concentrations that would have been toxic to most conquered species. A world teeming with organisms of staggering variety, from microscopic to immense, competing and cooperating and evolving at rates that the transmission presented as data and Vane experienced as awe. Earth, the word arrived without translation, as if it were a name so fundamental it needed no equivalent. Earth, the human homeworld. Humans. The transmission showed them. Bipedal, endothermic, bilaterally symmetrical, short-lived by conquered standards. A century was old for them and most achieved less. Small, fragile, poorly adapted to vacuum, radiation, temperature extremes, or any of the environmental conditions that most spacefaring species considered baseline survivable. They had no natural armor, no venom, no electromagnetic sensitivity, no capacity for photosynthesis or radiation metabolization. By every metric the conquered used to assess species viability, they were marginal, unremarkable, a footnote in the biodiversity survey of a minor spiral arm. And they had built something that the transmission took great care to present in full, because the thing they had built was the reason the canister existed. Vane saw it unfold across millennia, compressed into moments of understanding. The humans had emerged from their chaotic world and reached for the stars, clumsily at first, with chemical propulsion and fragile habitats, and a mortality rate that would have stopped any species with a longer planning horizon. They died in their ships. They died on hostile worlds. They died in the silence between stars, and they kept going, not because they were brave or wise or specially adapted, but because they could not stop. Curiosity was their pathology. The drive to know what lay beyond the next hill, the next ocean, the next star. It was embedded in them the way the archive's catalog was embedded in Vane's daily routine. Not a choice, a compulsion. They spread. Slowly, then faster, then in a rush that the transmission depicted as a kind of controlled explosion. Colony ships, relay stations, communication networks, mining operations, terraforming projects, research stations, diplomatic missions, trade routes, wars, treaties, collapses, rebuildings. And through all of it, the same relentless forward pressure, the same refusal to stay still, the same certainty that the next discovery would be worth the cost of reaching it. Their expansion had not been a triumphant march. The transmission was honest about this, almost painfully so. Colony ships that launched with 10,000 passengers and arrived with 300. Terraforming projects that failed and killed everyone on the surface. Wars between human factions that burned worlds they had spent centuries building. Plagues engineered as weapons that escaped containment and decimated populations on 30 planets simultaneously. The humans had stumbled, fallen, bled, and dragged themselves forward through wreckage of their own making with a stubbornness that the transmission did not frame as heroic. It framed it as pathological, a species addicted to the next horizon, incapable of sitting still, compelled by their own neurology to keep reaching even when reaching killed them. And they knew it. That was the part that Vane found most arresting. They understood their own flaw. They had studied it, named it, built entire philosophical traditions around the question of whether their relentless forward motion was a gift or a sickness. And they had concluded, with the kind of brutal self-knowledge that Vane recognized from his own species' best scholars, that it was both. The same drive that pushed them into the dark was the drive that kept them from preserving what they found there. They were brilliant openers and terrible keepers. They could crack any seal, decode any signal, bridge any gap. But behind them the bridges rotted, the seals corroded, the codes were forgotten, and the knowledge they had fought so hard to reach was lost to their own restlessness. And then they found the deep archives. Not one archive, thousands, scattered across a region of space so vast that the transmission could only represent it as a density map, points of light, each one a cache of knowledge left by civilizations that had come before. Ancient species, long extinct, who had recorded their histories, their sciences, their arts, their failures, and sealed them in containers designed to survive geological time. The humans found them the way Vane had found the canister, by noticing patterns that others missed, by being too stubborn to stop looking, by treating every anomaly as an invitation rather than a warning. They opened them. Of course they opened them. Opening things was what they did. And what they found inside changed them. Not immediately, not dramatically, but cumulatively over generations. The knowledge they extracted from the deep archives rewrote their understanding of physics, biology, materials science, energy production, and the fundamental architecture of space-time. They did not simply learn from the archives. They synthesized. They combined insights from species that had never known each other existed, bridging gaps that the original builders had never imagined could be bridged. And the result was a technological substrate that was not human and not alien, but something new. A fusion that exceeded its components the way an alloy exceeds its constituent metals. The transmission lingered on this point, and Vane understood why. It was important that he see not just what the humans had accomplished, but how they had accomplished it, the method, not just the result. Because the method was the problem. They synthesized by consuming. They opened the archives, extracted the knowledge, combined it with their own, and moved on. They did not maintain the archives they had opened. They did not repair what they had cracked to reach the contents within. They took and left, the way a predator takes and leaves, and the empty archives behind them degraded, their seals broken, their atmospheres compromised, their storage media exposed to environments they had been designed to never encounter. Within a century of being opened, most of the deep archives were irreparably damaged. Within 2 centuries, the knowledge they had contained existed only in human databases. Databases built with human storage technology, maintained according to human protocols, subject to human institutional failures. The humans had not destroyed the archives deliberately. They had destroyed them the way water destroys a riverbank, by flowing through. By being what they were, a species in motion, a species whose attention moved forward and never circled back. The transmission showed him examples of what they had lost along the way. Archives the humans had built and abandoned. Libraries they had funded and then defunded. Museums they had filled with the treasures of 100 worlds and then let crumble when the funding committee moved on to the next emergency. Research stations where centuries of accumulated data sat on degrading storage media because no one had thought to migrate it to newer formats. A civilization-wide pattern of discovery without maintenance, opening without keeping, reaching without holding. The losses were staggering. The transmission quantified them with a precision that made Vane's archivist's heart clench. 14% of all knowledge the humans had ever acquired was estimated to have been lost to their own negligence, not destroyed by enemies, not consumed by disasters, simply allowed to degrade because no one was paying attention. 14%, a number that would have resulted in criminal prosecution under Tessarine archival law. The transmission paused. Vane felt it gather, restructure, prepare for the next layer. His fingertip pulsed against the disk's surface, and the surface pulsed back, and the exchange felt less like data transfer and more like conversation. A slow, patient dialogue between the disks stored intelligence and Vane's capacity to receive it. The Conquered had never encountered humans. The transmission made this clear. The quarantine zone, the region of space that the Conquered Exploration Authority had declared off-limits 40 years ago, was the outer boundary of human-influenced space. The early survey teams that had entered the zone had encountered human artifacts, human signals, human automated systems, and had come back changed. Not because the humans had attacked them or manipulated them, but because the exposure to human technology and human information had altered their conceptual frameworks. They had seen what was possible. They could not unsee it. The debriefing reports, with their careful clinical euphemisms, were describing not damage but expansion, minds that had been stretched by contact with a species that thought differently, built differently, and refused to accept limitations that every conquered species treated as natural law. The Conquered had responded by closing the border, building a fence around a neighbor they did not understand, hoping the neighbor would stay on their side. It was the response of an institution that valued preservation over discovery, stability over change, the known over the unknown. It was, Vane realized with a sick clarity, exactly what the archival authority would have done. Exactly what he would have done, 8 days ago, before the canister. The disk's transmission shifted. Deeper now, more specific. Vane felt it focusing, narrowing from the broad sweep of human history to a single thread, a project, a purpose, a reason for the canister's existence. The humans knew about the Concord. They had known for a long time. Their automated systems had mapped Concord space decades before the first survey team crossed the quarantine border. They had studied Tessarene culture, Keldrathi engineering, Huvin linguistics, Maresi philosophy, all from a distance, through intercepted communications and retrieved artifacts and the patient, relentless analysis that was their species-defining trait. They understood the Concord the way an archivist understands a collection, thoroughly, respectfully, from the outside. And they had decided to make contact. Not through diplomacy. They knew enough about Concord politics to understand that a formal approach would trigger exactly the response it had triggered: fear, quarantine, a wall. Instead, they had chosen a method that was profoundly, characteristically human. They had placed a message in a bottle and put it on a shelf and waited for someone to find it. The canister, positioned on shelf 1417, column R, position 9, replacing an acoustic tablet that the humans had carefully removed and stored elsewhere. The disk showed Vane the location, a secondary vault in the annex's subsurface level, the tablet wrapped in the same alloy, preserved with the same care. Placed by a mechanism the disk did not describe in detail, because the humans valued their operational methods but placed with precision and with knowledge. They knew the Deepwell Annex. They knew its layout, its schedules, its security protocols, its atmospheric settings. They knew the manifest. And they knew this was the part that made Vane's breath catch. They knew who would find it. Not Vane specifically, not by name, but they had profiled the kind of person who would notice a substitution on an obscure shelf in a minor section of a secondary annex. The kind of person who would investigate instead of reporting. The kind of person whose curiosity would outweigh their institutional reflexes. The kind of person who would play a melody on a sealed cylinder in the small hours in a restricted vault, because the alternative was to not know, and not knowing was worse than any consequence. An archivist, a specific kind of archivist, one who cared more about the objects than the system, one whose obsession was not a weakness but a qualification. The transmission reached its core. The concentric rings of script on the disk spiraled inward, and Vane's comprehension spiraled with them, tightening toward the central character that pulsed at the heart of the message. The humans were not invading, not expanding, not threatening. They had reached the edge of their own knowledge. The deep archives had given them much, but the archives were finite and the humans were not. They had synthesized everything they had found, and the synthesis had shown them a gap, a missing piece, a category of knowledge that no archive contained, because the species that had possessed it had never recorded it in the formats the archives used. That knowledge was experiential, embodied, lived. It could not be written down or encoded in a cylinder or transmitted through a disk. It could only be carried by a living mind that had spent years, decades, immersed in the practice of preservation itself. Archival knowledge, the knowledge of how to keep things, how to maintain, restore, catalog, contextualize, and transmit fragile information across time without losing its meaning. The knowledge that Vane Solari had spent 11 quiet, unglamorous years accumulating in the amber light of the Deepwell Annex. The humans had built things that could reshape stars. They had technologies that the Concord could not comprehend. They had mapped regions of space that no Concord sensor could reach, but they did not know how to preserve. Their own history was riddled with losses, entire civilizations of knowledge burned or flooded or simply forgotten, because the humans were better at discovering than at keeping. They charged forward. They always charged forward. And behind them the trail grew thin, the records degraded, the connections frayed, and the meaning leached out of the data until what remained was information without context, facts without framework, archives without archivists. They needed a keeper, not a human keeper. They had tried that, and their own keepers were too restless, too easily drawn to the next discovery, too fundamentally human to sit with the quiet patience that true preservation demanded. They needed someone from a tradition that valued stillness, someone trained in the long, slow work of making things last. They needed Vane. Not Vane the person, Vane the archivist, the discipline, the patience, the 11 years of dust and amber light and uncomplaining attention to detail. The willingness to sit with an object until it revealed its nature, without forcing, without rushing, without losing interest when the object proved difficult or the institution lost faith. The deep archives the humans had found were degrading, not fast but steadily, the way everything degraded in the absence of maintenance. The knowledge they contained, the accumulated wisdom of species that had solved problems the conquered and humanity alike were still struggling with, was eroding, fading, becoming information without context, data without framework. And the rate of degradation was accelerating because the archives had been designed to be maintained, and no one was maintaining them. The original builders were gone. The humans had found the archives, opened them, extracted what they could, but extraction was not preservation. Taking knowledge out of an archive was not the same as keeping it alive inside one. The humans knew this. It was why they had sent the canister. The deep archives were not just degrading. They were disappearing. The transmission showed Vane the rate, a graph, rendered in the concentric script's visual language, plotting the number of accessible archives against time. The curve was not gentle. It was accelerating. Within a human generation, 80 years, a number that Vane's tessarine mind struggled to comprehend as a meaningful planning horizon, more than half of the remaining deep archives would be unrecoverable. The knowledge of species that had solved problems the galaxy was still wrestling with, energy containment methods, materials that self-repaired, communication protocols that worked across space-time curvature, would be gone. Not because anyone chose to destroy it, because no one chose to maintain it. The humans had tried. The transmission was emphatic about this. They had established preservation programs, funded conservation teams, built dedicated archival facilities modeled on the original builders' designs, and every program had failed. Not for lack of resources, the humans had resources beyond counting. Not for lack of intelligence, they understood the problem with painful clarity. The programs failed because the humans who staffed them could not stay still, could not sit with a single archive for the decades required to stabilize its contents, could not resist the urge to open the next one, scan the next cache, follow the next signal. The keepers the humans appointed became openers within a year. It was in their nature. It was who they were. And so they had looked outward, across the quarantine line, at the one civilization in their sensor range that had built its entire identity around the opposite impulse, the impulse to sit, to wait, to maintain, to keep, the tessarine. The central character on the disk pulsed its final meaning, and Vane received it the way he received everything, carefully, thoroughly, with the slow deliberation of a person who understood that some things, once understood, could not be ununderstood. Inheritor of the unfinished work. 5 words, not spoken aloud, delivered through the disk's tactile interface into the architecture of his comprehension, where language was not yet sound but was already meaning. A designation, a title, an identity offered across the gulf between two civilizations that had never met, by a species that had looked at the tessarine archival authority and seen not a bureaucracy but a treasure, a tradition of preservation that the humans, for all their brilliance, could not replicate. Vane lifted his finger from the disk. The blue-white light dimmed but did not extinguish. The vault was quiet. The fragments on the table had stopped their sympathetic hum, settling into a faint, steady glow that matched the disk's resting state. The canister lay open, its end caps retracted, the disk floating softly at its center, patient, unhurried, having delivered its message and now waiting for the response. The vault felt different now. The same amber light, the same controlled atmosphere, the same 12 shelves of classified objects, but the space between the shelves had changed character, the way a room changes when you learn that someone important once stood in it. This vault, this secondary facility in a secondary annex, had been chosen. Selected from across the breadth of conquered space by a civilization that could have placed their message anywhere and had placed it here, among the sealed and forgotten fragments of their own debris, in the one institution in the conquered that would least expect to find a message from beyond the quarantine line. Not in a capital, not in a research center, not in a military installation, in an archive. Because the humans understood, had calculated, modeled, confirmed through their own painful experience, that the message they needed to send could only be received by someone who already lived inside the practice they were seeking. Not a diplomat, not a scientist, not a leader, a keeper. Vane stared at the disk for a long time. He thought about Olesi, his supervisor, and her formal reminders and her 24-hour grace period. He thought about the curatorial board and their 18-month review cycles, and their 38 years of classified inertness for fragments that turned out to be the most important material in the archive. He thought about the manifest in position 9, and the acoustic tablet that was supposed to be there, and was not. He thought about the quarantine zone, and the debriefing reports, and the careful clinical euphemisms that had described minds stretched by contact with something they could not unsee. He thought about 11 years. 11 years of dust and silence and uncomplaining labor, day after day, shelf after shelf, artifact after artifact, each one handled with the same care, the same attention, the same reverence for the act of keeping. 11 years that had felt until 8 days ago like the sum of his career, the whole of what he was. An archivist in a secondary annex, valued invisibly, cited once. And now a species from beyond the quarantine line was telling him that those 11 years were not invisible. That they had been watched, assessed, valued, not by his supervisors, not by the board, not by anyone in the conquered, but by strangers who had placed a canister on his shelf and waited for him to find it because they knew, they had calculated, they had profiled and predicted and confirmed that Vane Solari was exactly the kind of mind they needed. Not because he was brilliant, because he was patient, because he was thorough, because he cared about the objects more than the system, and that caring was the one quality that all their technology could not manufacture. The obsession that had driven him for 8 days was not madness. It was an aptitude test, and he had passed. Vane picked up the disk. The light flared briefly as his fingers closed around it, a warm pulse, almost affectionate, like a hand clasping his in recognition. The concentric rings of script glowed through his fingers, and in their light he could see, faintly, the outline of what the humans were offering. Not just a title, a partnership. A role in something vast and unfinished, something that would require not years but generations of patient, meticulous, unglamorous work. The work of making knowledge last, of building an archive that could survive not just centuries but the deep time that ate civilizations and left nothing but structural debris misidentified as geology. The unfinished work was not a metaphor, it was a project specification. An archive of archives, built by a partnership between the species that found things and the species that kept them. Human curiosity and Tessarine patience, the charger and the keeper, the opener and the preserver. Two halves of a capability that neither species possessed alone, and that the deep archives desperately needed, because without it the knowledge would be lost. Not to catastrophe, not to war, not to any dramatic ending, but to the slow, quiet, unglamorous process of decay that was the archivist's oldest enemy. Vane understood decay. He had spent 11 years fighting it in the Deepwell Annex, one shelf at a time, one atmospheric seal at a time, one careful measurement at a time. He had fought it without recognition, without promotion, without anyone noticing except the objects themselves, which endured because he did. And now the humans were saying, "We noticed. We saw what you do. We need what you do. Come and do it where it matters most. Inheritor of the unfinished work. Vane placed the disc back inside the canister. The end cap slid forward, sealing it again, the grooved script settling into its resting configuration. The electromagnetic pulse steadied to its baseline rhythm. The glow on the fragments faded to darkness. The canister sat on the reading table, dark and dense, looking like exactly what the manifest would have called it if the manifest had known it was there. An artifact. A piece of the past, waiting to be understood. And they had been patient about it. That was the detail that mattered most to Vane, not the technology, not the scope, not the civilization-spanning scale of the project they were proposing. The patience. They had placed the canister and waited. They had not forced contact. They had not hacked the archive systems or announced themselves to the conquered council or landed a ship on the Tessarine homeworld's capital lawn. They had put a message in a bottle on a shelf and trusted that the right person would find it. They had trusted Tessarine patients to meet their own. Two species that specialized in different things, one that opened, one that kept. And between them, a canister on a shelf, pulsing its quiet melody into the dark, a handshake offered across the distance between civilizations by the only method that both could respect, the method of waiting until it was found. He gathered his notes. 32 photographs, 8 days of spectral readings, 2 days of mechanical seal analysis, the translation database's null result, the star map identification, the melody he had played to open the lock, the sensor node data showing 60 days of signal growth, the provenance record of the missing acoustic tablet, the fragment resonance measurements. Everything documented, everything recorded. The archivist's reflex, the archivist's discipline, applied to the most important object he had ever held. He organized the documentation into the standard archival assessment format, the same format he had used for 642 previous objects, the same headers, the same section order, the same methodical progression from physical description to material analysis to provenance to significance assessment. The format was bureaucratic. It was dry. It was designed for municipal records and minor acquisitions, and applying it to an artifact that contained a message from a civilization beyond the quarantine line was absurd in the same way that using a teacup to hold an ocean was absurd. But the format was what Vane knew. It was the structure his mind worked within. And as he organized his findings into its familiar sections, he felt the enormity of what he had learned settle into something he could carry, not smaller, not simpler, but organized, indexed, retrievable, the way archives made the vast manageable. He would file the assessment with the board. Not Ulysses' Standing Order 16 report, that was a notification form, a flag. What he would file was a full archival assessment, the kind that took weeks to prepare, the kind that the board could not dismiss with a form letter because it contained too much data, too much evidence, too much meticulous documentation to ignore. He would bury the quarantine zone connection in the provenance section, where the board's reviewers, who were, like all institutional reviewers inclined to skim, would find it only if they read carefully, which they would because the material analysis section would stop them cold. Unknown alloy, unknown trace elements, active electromagnetic emission, sympathetic resonance with sealed quarantine zone fragments. Every line a fact, every fact documented, every document cross-referenced. An archivist's argument built the archivist's way, not by shouting but by being thorough. He left the restricted vault and sealed the door behind him. The corridor stretched before him, long and amber-lit, shelves rising on both sides to the high ceiling, 12 million objects sleeping in their catalogued positions. He walked slowly, his footsteps soft on the climate-controlled floor, and he felt the weight of the archive around him differently than he had felt it 8 days ago, not as a burden, not as a monument to institutional inertia, but as a practice, a discipline refined across centuries, a way of being that the humans, from their place beyond the quarantine line, had recognized as precious. The Tessarine Archival Authority did not know what it had, Not in the canister. That was a human gift, specific and deliberate. What the authority did not know it had was the tradition itself. The patient, meticulous, unglamorous practice of keeping. The willingness to sit with an object for 11 years and not lose interest. The refusal to prioritize the new over the enduring. The understanding that preservation was not a service industry for more exciting disciplines, not a support function for explorers and discoverers and synthesizers, but a discipline in its own right, with its own rigor, its own creativity, its own irreplaceable value. The humans had understood that. From beyond a quarantine line, across a gulf of incomprehension and institutional fear, a species that specialized in opening things had looked at a species that specialized in keeping things and seen not a lesser capability but a complementary one. Not servants for their archive. Partners. Equals in a work that required both. Vane reached the annex entrance. The biometric scanner read his palm and the door opened. Morning light, real light, not the amber simulation of the reading lamps, flooded the threshold, pale and sharp, the light of a tessarine dawn that smelled of mineral dust and ozone. He stood in the doorway and breathed it in, and behind him the annex hummed its quiet, eternal hum, 12 million objects waiting in their controlled atmosphere, each one a piece of the past that someone, somewhere, had thought was worth keeping. He would go back to the vault. He would retrieve the canister. He would contact the coordinates the disk had shown him, a specific relay point, just inside the quarantine border, where a human automated system waited for a signal it had been programmed to recognize. He would send the signal, and the signal would be received, and the unfinished work would begin. He did not know what would come after that. The disk had shown broad strokes, a collaboration, a partnership, an archive built across the space between two civilizations, but the details were unwritten. They were unwritten because the details depended on him, on his decisions, on the way he chose to apply 11 years of archival discipline to a problem that no archivist in history had ever faced. The humans had the technology to preserve anything. What they lacked was the philosophy. The understanding that preservation was not a technical problem, but a conceptual one. That keeping knowledge alive meant not just storing data, but maintaining the relationships between data points, the context that made facts meaningful, the framework that connected isolated discoveries into coherent understanding. That understanding was not something that could be programmed into a database or engineered into a storage medium. It had to be lived. It had to be practiced. It had to be carried in the habits of a mind that had spent years learning to see connections that faster, more brilliant minds overlooked. Vane was not certain he was equal to it. He was certain he would try. And he was certain, with the certainty that came from touching the disk and feeling, for one long moment, the weight of what was at stake, that trying was what the humans had counted on. Not success, not genius, not transformation. Just the willingness to sit with an impossible task and do the small work, day after day, shelf after shelf, until the impossible became merely very difficult and the very difficult became routine. That was what archivists did. That was what Vane did. But first he would file his daily shelf condition reports, all 8 days' worth. He would update the manifest. He would respond to Ulysses' formal reminders with the correct forms, properly completed, submitted through the correct channels. He would do the small work, the invisible work, the work that kept the archive alive. Because that was the work that had qualified him. That was the work the humans had seen and valued. And that was the work he would carry forward into whatever came next. The same patience, the same attention, the same quiet refusal to let anything be lost. Inheritor of the unfinished work. The title sat in him like a seed in dark soil, not growing yet, not visible, but alive and waiting and certain. Vane Solari closed the annex door behind him and walked into the morning light, carrying the weight of 2 civilizations' futures in the muscle memory of an archivist's careful hands.